Welcome to Chapter 10 of Social Work 225. In this chapter, we are talking about drugs and alcohol and tobacco. And while I think that these potentially could be used in a healthy manner, I'm not sure about tobacco. But alcohol and drugs, I guess that you could argue that they have their medicinal effects. There are some positive benefits to them. But unfortunately, a lot of people do not use them in a healthy manner. And some people lose their ability to use them within their own control. And so it leads to a lot of preventable health conditions. In fact, drugs, alcohol, and tobacco lead to more preventable health issues than anything else. And so this looks like deaths, it looks like illnesses and disabilities. In fact, 1/4 of all deaths are attributable to these things, which makes them really expensive. Our book gives an estimate at somewhere between 400 and 500 billion dollars a year in terms of what it costs us. Right? Now, there are direct costs, such as if people overdose and then they go to the hospital, there's healthcare costs associated with that. But then if that person goes to work and they are hungover or maybe they're still intoxicated, you have reduced productivity, you have people who are going to die prematurely due to their alcohol, tobacco, and drug use. And then there's the indirect costs, such as you need additional law enforcement and you need additional dollars to spent on rehabilitating those people or jailing those people, and you need therapists and social workers to help get them off of those substances. And even looking at children, there are other costs associated with juvenile delinquent workers and centers. And then if that person gets a conviction, then they have that on their record, and that makes it difficult for them to gain a good job, and it will reduce their overall economic productivity likely throughout their life. So people who are using drugs and alcohol, especially in an unhealthy manner, are more likely to use more government services. They're less productive. They're going to the police station more often. They're going to the counseling station more often. So communities that have lots of this use tend to be much more expensive on the government systems. Looking specifically at high school students, good news here, their use of alcohol and drugs is down. And even marijuana, which our book says is the one exception, it actually has gone down in the last 10 years. And even the legalization of marijuana, which a lot of people were saying, like, well, maybe this is going to cause the use to go up, it doesn't seem to have impacted use that much. Well, let's look at factors that contribute to abuse. And abuse is different than use in the sense that, potentially someone could use marijuana maybe at the end of a day as just kind of a way of calming down and relaxing. But then abuse is going to cause people to lose control of their use, and they're having to use it before they go to work, and they're having to use it before they interact with their loved ones, and they're maybe having to use it to sleep, or the doctor says you can use it in this manner, and they're using it in a different manner than that. Here's another example, maybe like the pills, maybe they are oxycodone, and the doctor says, take one a day, and the person takes 3 a day, and then rather than swallowing them, which is going to cause them to release more slowly, they're going to crush them up and snort them as a way of getting a quick high, and that would be considered abuse. Right? So factors that contribute to abuse, such as, some people can use drugs and alcohol, tobacco, and they don't seem to be that impacted by it. And then other people, it's like they are finding this one thing that they've been looking for their whole life. So risk factors would include genetics. Some reason their genetics just lead them to abuse more than others. People's families. If their families are using, then more likely they are going to be using. Societies that promote alcohol use, promote tobacco use, promote drug abuse, cultures that promote it, are we're going to see more abuse than cultures that don't promote it. We had a foreign exchange student when I was in high school, and she talked about how when she was back in Sweden, the only people that really used drugs was sort of the old homeless guy who lived in the park. Well, that is a good advertisement for living a drug-free life. When you think about drugs, if you think about homeless people in parks, do you want to be like them? No. All right, well then don't do what he's doing. What is he doing? He's using drugs. So whereas maybe in our culture, we're seeing the rock star on stage singing about his favorite drug, right? Well, that's going to make people want to be like him and use the drugs that he's using. Protective factors. There are things that cause people to shy away from abuse. And again, genetics. Some people, it just doesn't impact them very much. Healthy home environments, when their peers aren't using it, when their family isn't using it. These are protective factors. So, personality seems to have an impact as well. Some people are more impulsive. If you put something before them that they want, even though they may be thinking, I'm not going to eat the cookies, when they are in front of them, they're going to grab it and put it in their mouth without even thinking about it. They have trouble controlling their impulses. They are more likely to experience substance abuse. People who are more moody, and perhaps that they're looking for a way of calming their moods, and drug, alcohol, and tobacco is a way of doing that. I would say it's not a great way of doing it, but it is effective to some degree. Some people will use it. Home life makes a difference. When parents are steady, when there are rules and they're followed consistently, and that there's warmth and that there is love, then this is a protective factor against that. Whereas where then there's family turmoil, when people are moving in and out and mom and dad are maybe fighting a lot, and there's inconsistency, and there's people who are the family is moving from one place to another. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of difficulty. There's not much clear communication going along. People aren't getting along. More likely to have substance abuse there. The environment also makes an impact. When there are more liquor stores, when there are billboards with attractive people talking about drugs and alcohol, this is going to cause people to be more likely to abuse. On the other hand, when there are taxes on things like tobacco, when I was 15, cigarettes, pack of name brand cigarettes was going to be about $1 or $1.25. Today, that same pack of cigarettes is going to be close to $8 or $10. Well, that causes people to not want to use cigarettes as much because it's so much more expensive than it was in the past. Let's talk about alcohol. Alcohol is the #1 problem drug in America. If you look at the impacts of alcohol, and even in comparing it to tobacco, certainly to any other drug, there's more problems with alcohol than any else. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at the number of people who abuse alcohol versus the number of people who abuse any other drug, alcohol is much higher. If you look at the number of people who are injured and people who die due to alcohol, it's much higher. And it costs more to society. It causes more broken homes. It causes more people to lose their jobs, lose their licenses, breaks up families. It was related to abuse, rape, things like that, right? So kind of far and away, alcohol is probably the worst in terms of the consequences of it. Much of the alcohol is drunk by younger people between 18 and 24 years old. Even though you can't legally drink until you're 21 in the United States, still you have a lot of alcohol that's being drunk by people who are underage. Beer is the highest risk drink, meaning the beer is associated with more of the problems that we just mentioned. However, distilled alcohols are the strongest. Binge drinking, which is characterized by 5 or more drinks for a man in a single setting or 4 or more drinks in a single setting for a woman, accounts for about 95,000 deaths per year. 95,000 deaths. That equals about 360 deaths per day. And this is very expensive. It's very costly in terms of human life. Our book estimates that it's more than $200 billion is the cost for excessive alcohol consumption, and about 35, we'll just say like 1 out of every 3 college students is involved in binge drinking. So, what is the effect of binge drinking? Well, the effect of, I guess, drinking in general is that you have lowered anxiety, right? And anxiety is a real problem in the United States, so it makes sense that alcohol would be a tempting substance for somebody to use who is experiencing anxiety, a mild euphoria, right? And it is not a problem for the vast majority of people who use, right? Only about 10% of people who drink will have a problem. Unfortunately, 10% is quite a bit, because if you have most people who have at least drunk at some point in their life, then we're talking hundreds of millions of people. Well, 10% of those is still quite a large number of people. And then if you look at the number of people who are impacted not necessarily by their own drinking, but by somebody else's. So, for instance, if dad is the one who's drinking and has a problem, then the children in the home, they're not drinking, but they are impacted by dad. So, alcoholism is about becoming dependent on alcohol. They need it, or they believe that they need it anyway, in order to survive. And at some point, if the person has dependence, then their body actually does need it. So that if you were to remove the alcohol from some people, they actually were going to begin to experience lots of health problems and could potentially even fatal health problems. So alcohol is also characterized by a loss of control over their drinking. They may only intend to drink so much, but they can't seem to be able to contain how much they are using. So it costs about $220 billion per year. That equals about $750 per person in the United States, whether they drink or not, if you average that out. So it's a very costly, it affects a lot of people, and it's the number one drug problem in America. Alcohol is often a contributing factor to rapes in the general community, but also on college campuses especially. It's often present in the body of the victim or the perpetrator. And one of the impacts it also has on the body is that it reduces the body's protection against infection. It pushes down the immune system response, right? It also can be a contributing factor to fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome is where the baby in the womb is exposed to alcohol, and it has a negative impact on its development. Today, there's about 40,000 babies that are born with symptoms of prenatal exposure to alcohol. What's interesting to me is that in the United States, we actually do not drink as much as many countries, especially countries like Russia or countries in Europe, and yet we have more alcoholism than those countries. And they say that, well, Malcolm Gladwell said that it has to do with the culture of drinking. So, for instance, in some countries like Ireland, and in the United States too, alcohol is sort of removed from daily life. It's drunk by itself in say, a bar or at a party where drinking is the activity that's being done, right? As opposed to other cultures like Italy, where people are drinking probably from a very young age. 9, 10, you're being introduced to wine, but they're not just drinking. They're sitting around the kitchen table, and they're having dinner together, and they're sharing a meal, and they're doing other things. And that in and of itself seems like it's a protective factor against alcoholism. So just kind of interesting to me. Looking at nicotine. Nicotine is the active drug in tobacco, or at least one of the active drugs in tobacco. So it's going to show up in cigarettes, in cigars, and then in smokeless tobacco, chew. The federal law around this is that you cannot give tobacco to minors. And over the last, especially like 20 years, there's been a lot more laws passed to try to control tobacco use in Americans. And so one of the things is that the taxes on tobacco have gone up a lot in the last 20 years, and that seems to have a positive impact, meaning a lot less people today are using tobacco than they were 20 years ago. And even more people were using it back in the 1960s than were 20 years ago. So that's heading in the right direction. So our book says that in New York City, a pack of cigarettes is over $11, right? And so that's a lot of money for just 20 cigarettes. And so that causes people to kind of think twice about it. It used to be that you could get light or mild cigarettes, and that kind of gave the impression that these cigarettes were not as bad as, say, the full flavored or the full strength of a cigarette. But in 2010, they removed those labels as they were not giving an accurate picture of what the cigarette actually was, because you'd really get the same amount of nicotine in a regular cigarette, say like a Marlboro Red, as you would in a Marlboro Light. But I guess Marlboro Lights are no longer in existence because they're no longer able to use that term. So, all right, what are the consequences for tobacco use? Well, you're breathing in a lot of tar, and so that tar is going to the throat and then to the lungs, and so that is going to reduce the ability of the lungs to absorb oxygen, right? And so if your lungs aren't able to absorb the oxygen, then you're going to have to breathe a lot more air in just so you can get the amount that you need to your heart. And so tobacco, especially if it's smoked, is going to impact the areas where the smoke goes at least first, right? So you're going to see problems in the mouth, you're going to see problems in the throat, you're going to see problems in the lungs. And so that's where the cancers or the other problems show up. But because oxygen is needed by every cell in the body, then potentially every cell is going to be impacted by cigarettes. So this is one of the reasons why the government has clamped down on tobacco so much, because it's such a deadly substance for us to use. So about 400,000 premature deaths per year, costing us about $193 billion in lost productivity and medical costs. So, and not only just for the person who uses, but also for secondhand smokers. So this could be children in the back seat, or the guy on the plane. It used to be you could smoke in planes, and pretty much most places, restaurants and movie theaters and places like that, of which I don't think you can do that in hardly anywhere anymore. So tobacco is considered a Class A carcinogen, just like asbestos. All right, moving on to over-the-counter drugs. These would include things like aspirin and cough syrup and cold medicine, right? And these are often giving symptomatic relief, meaning they are taking away the symptoms of the problem. You know, the headache is caused by, let's say, a lack of water. It's dehydration, oftentimes what causes headaches. And so we take an aspirin, and that blocks the signals going to the brain, and so the headache goes away. But it doesn't actually deal with the underlying issue, which is dehydration. So, all right. Well, you can misuse over-the-counter drugs, and this is when someone uses too much, right? Or they use it for the wrong reasons. You know, they could use a cough medicine as a way of becoming intoxicated, but it's made to deal with coughs, not to intoxicate people. So that would be an example of misuse. Prescription drugs are also something that people misuse. So Misuse is when someone is taking too much of the prescription, or too little of the prescription, or they're giving some of it away, or they are stopping early, which can create resistance to, which can create the cold or the infection can become resistant to the drug, and the illness can spread. So prescription drug use can include a lot more things. And prescription drug use is the fastest growing drug problem. In fact, in the last 20 years, what they've seen is that most illegal drug use has gone down. I guess meth is maybe the exception there. But the drugs that when I was a teenager, they warned us against, and we were very aware of, things like cocaine and crack and heroin, not heroin because heroin's actually gone up, but marijuana. And most of these drugs, their use of them has gone down really significantly. So that's a great thing. So while many of the drugs that I was warned against as a child have gone down, or they become legal, for instance, like marijuana, the use of opioids has gone through the roof. Right? Now, what is an opioid? An opioid, originally, this came from the poppy plant, and and they still grow lots of poppies, especially in the Middle East, and those are used oftentimes on the black markets. I think South America also has quite a bit of them too. But they have since created a synthetic version of the opioids, and this will come in morphine and codeine and oxycodone, and these are meant to reduce pain among patients, right? And many people have gotten hooked because they had a car accident and they had back pain, and their doctor gave them 30 opioid pills, and after taking those pills, they found that they just could not stop. And maybe their doctor gives them more, or maybe they go to another doctor to get a prescription, or maybe they go back to their doctor and then 3 other doctors just so they can get more and more of these pills, and maybe they begin to sell them, or maybe they begin to start on heroin because the doctor won't give them more. But it's almost like a very innocent beginning. They got it from the doctor, and the doctor knows best, and so we're doing what the doctor says, without realizing how addictive these substances are. And so what happens, opioids, is that they take away pain, and users will sometimes talk about opioids as being like wrapped in the warmest blanket that you could ever imagine. And it takes away all the pain and the discomfort, and people are, it's a depressant, so people aren't aroused like they would under cocaine, but they are, just very sleepy and sort of warm feeling, and it also, people can become more tolerant to the drug. And so maybe the first one you need first time you need a half of a pill, and the second time you need a whole pill, and second time a third pill. And maybe somebody gets arrested because they broke into somebody's vehicle to steal something, and so they go to jail for 3 days, and then they get out and they go back home and they take 3 pills because that's what they used before. But that kills them because their body has lost its tolerance very, very quickly. And so it's one of the things that makes this very deadly, is that we can build up a tolerance, but then we lose that tolerance very, very quickly. And there's been a lot of overdose deaths, even in our area here in Southern Illinois. Fortunately, there are good treatments for opioid use, including methadone. Methadone is an effective treatment for opioid use. Unfortunately, there's some stigmatization against its use. There are also other drugs, but unfortunately, I think people are scared of using them because they feel like any drug that's being used by somebody who's addicted to opioids is a bad thing for them to have. And so I think there's probably a lack of use, and there is other things that would reduce the harm of use, such as needle exchange programs where somebody who is using, say, heroin could go get clean needles, and that's going to prevent them from adding a blood-borne disease that they would catch from another user on top of their opium addiction. Okay, so to kind of wrap this up, let's talk about what we can do as a society to help people who are having trouble with drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. So when it comes to alcohol, there are treatment facilities that are available for people. Probably if we did the same thing with alcohol that we do with tobacco in terms of increasing the cost, you're probably going to see the use go down. As we sort of slowly transition to driverless vehicles, it may be that many of the drunken driving casualties that are associated with alcohol use may go down. So we can hope for that. When it comes to tobacco, I think that tobacco use is down pretty low, especially among young people. The substitute for tobacco use is e-cigarettes, which contains tobacco, but we didn't mention that much. And it's become much more popular to use e-cigarettes as opposed to traditional tobacco products. But I don't know, about 5 years ago, I think, there was some major research that came out that showed that e-cigarettes are not the safe alternative that they were thought of before. And since then, I just haven't seen as much use, but I'm not basing that up on real data. It's just my own observations. So in terms of opioid use, I think that if we would treat drug users like we do people who have heart disease, we would be seeing a lot better results. So typically when somebody has a drug use problem, they are treated like a criminal as opposed to somebody who has a health problem. And so I think that the more we can shift to that mindset, the less of a problem it's going to be, because people are going to be receiving treatment as opposed to be going to jail, and the kind of the barriers to even getting help will be reduced. And I think clamping down on the manufacturers of these drugs and putting more pressure on the whole medical industry to make sure that the pills that are being produced are going to the people who need them. And I would argue, because I just read this book about opium use, we probably are overprescribing opium. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I think that there are many times when opium is being prescribed when it doesn't have to be prescribed, or it could be just prescribed, 3 pills rather than 20 pills, and that's going to reduce the amount of addiction that would occur for people. And so I think that continuing to find out what works in terms of educating younger people. When I was in school, we had the DARE program, and that was unfortunately shown not to be very effective. But there are other things that are likely to be much more effective, and so using those programs as a way of educating people, it would be a positive use of the money that goes toward those things. And so, because it's the most preventable health problem that we have, I think there's a lot of good and a lot of things that we could do to help out this problem, and those would be worth our time and energy.